She was 34 years old, and in the raw gray spring of 1871, she stood on the courthouse steps of Thistledown Falls, Vermont, with everything she owned in a flour sack and a dog pressed against her skirts. Her father-in-law, Reuben Ashcombe, had put her off the family land not 3 days after her husband's grave had settled, saying a widow with no sons had no claim on a farm that carried his name. She had $11, a wool blanket, a cast-iron pot, and a rope-thin hope that refused to die no matter how many times the winter tried to kill it. When the auctioneer's gavel fell that afternoon, on a ruin nobody else would touch, the old Thorn fulling mill, sealed for 20 years, sold for $23, and the promise to pay back taxes, the whole square laughed and called her a fool. She only tightened her grip on the leash, looked down at the reddish-brown hound, who never once looked away from her, and told herself that foolishness had never yet frightened her half as much as poverty had. She did not know, not yet, that the mill was hiding something sealed beneath its floor that would change her life and give an entire town back its stolen name. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Verity Ashcombe and her faithful dog Birch. If this story of quiet courage and an old dog's nose for the truth stirs something in you, tell us in the comments where you'd have started, because we love hearing how you'd have found your own footing. Verity Coe had been raised on the smell of wet wool and river water, in a low fieldstone house at the edge of Thistledown Falls, where her father, Amos Coe, had run a small custom fulling operation before the big Thorn mill put half the valley's independent fullers out of business. Amos was not a bitter man, though he had every reason to be. He taught his only daughter the trade instead of resenting the loss of it, walking her through the vats and the stocks and the drying racks as though the craft itself were a kind of scripture. He showed her how raw woven cloth, loose and coarse off the loom, could be pounded and shrunk, and worked with fuller's earth, until it became something dense, and warm, and worthy of a hard Vermont winter, and he told her more than once, that the same was true of people, that trial was not ruin, only the process by which something loose became something that could hold. Her mother had died birthing her, so it was Amos who braided her hair too tight, and Amos who taught her sums by counting bolts of cloth, and when she was 9 years old, it was Amos who came home from the river one April evening with a half-drowned, burr-matted puppy tucked inside his coat, its ribs showing, its color somewhere between rust and chestnut bark. She had named him Birch on the spot, for the pale blaze on his chest that reminded her of stripped bark, and from that night, the dog slept at the foot of her bed, and followed her step for step through the fulling shed, learning the rhythm of the work as surely as she did. Amos used to say a good fuller's hands and a good dog's nose worked the same way. Both of them found what was hidden inside a thing by patience, not force, though he could not have known how literally his daughter would one day need to prove him right. She remembered, long after he was gone, the particular ritual of a Saturday evening in that fieldstone shed, her father lifting a length of newly fulled wool from the stocks, still dripping, and holding it up to the last of the window light so she could see how the loose, sorry weave of the morning had been worked, hour by patient hour, into something close and dense enough to turn rain. Cloth doesn't know it's strong until you've troubled it a while, he told her once, wringing the water from it with his big scarred hands, and she had rolled her eyes the way any girl of 12 rolls her eyes at a parent's favorite saying, never once suspecting how many winters of her own life she would spend proving him right. He taught her to read a fleece by feel, before she ever learned to read a book by sight, to know staple length and crimp, and the particular sourness of wool gone wrong in the vat. And he taught her, too, the quieter craft of a small trade run honestly in a town full of larger operations, how to keep her own ledger square, how to turn away work she could not do well, rather than do it poorly, how to treat every farmer's wife who brought her a bolt of homespun as though the cloth mattered as much to her as it plainly mattered to them. Birch the first grew up underfoot through all of it, learning the difference between the customer's wagons and a stranger's step long before Verity herself could tell them apart by sound, and there were evenings she could still recall with an ache. her father humming some tuneless old hymn over the stalks, the dog asleep in a patch of last sun by the door, the whole small world of the shed smelling of lanolin and wood smoke and rain not yet fallen, that she would have given a great deal, in the hard years that came after, to have back even once. She met John Ashcombe at 18, a steady sunburned young farmer with a laugh too big for his frame, and when her father died 2 winters into their courtship, she carried the fulling trade into her marriage the way another bride might carry a dowry of silver. John's family had land enough that the little fieldstone fulling house was let go, its equipment sold for scrap, and Verity folded her craft away like a good dress kept for occasions that never came, believing there would be time enough later to take it back up. She and John built a life on the Ashcombe farm that was plain and hard-working, and, in its own quiet way, happy. They never had children, a private grief she carried without complaint, and Birch grew old beside her, then died gently by the hearth in the winter she turned 29, and it seemed for a long while that some part of her had gone into the ground with him. It was John who brought her the pup that became her second Birch, for she could not bear to call him anything else, a lean, watchful hound, with the same rust-bark coloring, found half-starved, behind the grist mill, and carried home under John's coat, exactly as her father had once carried the first. "Same dog, come back around," John told her, and though she knew that was only a kindness, and not a fact, she chose to believe it anyway, because belief of that kind had always been the thing that got her through. Those were the years she thought of, later, as the good years, and she held on to their memory, the way a person holds a coal through a long cold night, cupping it carefully, so the wind cannot reach it. John died of a lung fever in the autumn of 1869, quickly and cruelly, and Verity nursed him through it, with Birch lying pressed against his legs every single night, as though the dog's own warmth might hold him to the earth. It did not. She buried her husband beside her father in the little churchyard above the falls, and for a season Reuben Ashcombe was almost kind to her, letting her keep the house and the herd, and the modest debts that came with them, so long as she kept his son's name on the mailbox, and his grandchildren's absence unspoken between them. But 2 dry summers in a row broke the farm's back the way nothing else could have. The first summer the creek that watered the lower pasture ran to a trickle by August, and the hay came in so thin and brittle it crumbled to dust in a closed fist. The second summer was worse still, a summer of hard white skies, and grasshoppers thick enough to darken a fence rail, and by its end, the herd that had once numbered 30 head, was down to 11 bony cows Verity fed by hand, from a dwindling store of grain. She rose before light both those summers to carry water up from the low spring in buckets yoked across her shoulders, Birch pacing beside her the whole distance, as though his company alone might lighten the load, and she went to bed each night with her hands cracked at the knuckle, and a fear in her chest that had nothing dramatic about it at all, only the slow, grinding certainty of a household running out of margin. Reuben Ashcombe watched all of it from his own comfortable kitchen a half-mile off, and offered nothing but complaint, remarking more than once within her hearing that a farm run by a woman alone could hardly be expected to hold its own against a hard season, as though her aching back and her ruined hands were themselves a kind of evidence against her, rather than proof of how hard she had tried. It was in the depths of that second dry summer that the note Reuben had co-signed years before, with the Thistledown Falls Bank, came due at the worst possible hour. He blamed her for it, publicly and often, telling the town that a woman alone could not be expected to hold a farm together, and when the bank's agent, a soft-spoken, precisely dressed man named Silas Pruitt, came to call about the debt, Reuben signed the farm over to cover it, rather than see a single dollar of his own capital touched. Verity was given 11 days to leave the only home she had known in 11 years, and though she asked Reuben, once, quietly, whether there was any arrangement to be made, he only told her that a widow ought to be grateful she wasn't put out sooner. Silas Pruitt, for his part, watched the whole exchange from beside his handsome bay horse, with an expression of mild, unreadable patience. the kind of patience a man wears when a thing is going exactly as he intended it to. She left the Ashcombe farm on a wet March morning with her flour sack, her father's old fulling shears wrapped in oilcloth, $11 folded into her boot, and Birch trotting at her heel as though nothing in the world had changed, which was, she thought, the closest thing to grace she had left. She took a room above the dry goods store for 2 nights, mending and taking in wash to add to her small stake, and it was there she heard the courthouse gossip about the old Thorn fulling mill going up for a tax sale that Saturday. A ruin at the bend of Coldwater Creek, that had stood sealed and silent since its founder Elias Thorn vanished from the valley some 20 years before, under circumstances nobody in town seemed willing to discuss above a whisper. The building was said to be unsafe, the water rights tangled, the whole property cursed with bad luck since the day old Thorn disappeared, and Silas Pruitt himself, oddly enough, had twice tried and failed to have it added quietly to the bank's own holdings. When Saturday came, Verity stood at the back of the small crowd on the courthouse steps, with Birch sitting calm and attentive at her side, and when the auctioneer called the mill and got no bids at all, she surprised herself as much as anyone by lifting her hand and offering every dollar she had left in the world. $23, plus the back taxes she'd pay in labor and time, bought her a crumbling stone mill nobody wanted, a dry mill race choked with a decade of leaves, and the disbelieving laughter of half the town, who began calling her Mad Verity before she'd even walked the property. She walked out to the mill the following dawn, with Birch ranging ahead of her along the old cart track, and the building that met her was worse, and somehow better than she had braced for. Worse in its broken shutters, and its roof gone soft with rot in one corner. Better in the honest good bones of its fieldstone walls, laid by a builder who had known exactly what he was doing. Inside, the great fulling stocks stood silent under a felt of dust, the drying racks sagged but held, and the smell of the place, though gone dry and cold, still carried a ghost of lanolin and river water that struck her like a hand pressed flat against her chest. Sunlight came slanting through the broken shutter boards in long dusty ribbons, catching a fine drift of chaff still hanging in the still air after 20 years, and she walked the length of the main floor slowly, one palm trailing along the cool stone of the walls, reading the building the way her father had taught her to read a fleece, by feel, by smell, by the small true signs a thing gives of what it once was and might yet be again. Birch ranged the room ahead of her with his nose down and his tail low and businesslike, working the perimeter the way he worked any new barn or shed, and she let him go, grateful for the company of a creature who found nothing in an abandoned mill to fear. She had scraped and scrubbed one corner of the main floor clean enough to see the old chestnut boards beneath, when Birch, who had been sniffing his methodical way along the base of the north wall, stopped dead over one particular flagstone near the foot of the fulling stocks, and began to dig at it with an urgency she had never once seen in him, whining low in his throat, and pawing at the seam between the stone and its neighbors, as if something on the other side of it was calling him by name. She knelt beside him, more to quiet him than from any real expectation, and it was only when her fingers found the stone's edge loose, and slightly proud of the floor around it, that her heart began, for the first time in 2 years, to beat with something other than grief. It took her the better part of that first week to work the flagstone free, prying at it in the evenings by lantern light, after long days spent patching the roof and clearing the mill race, and Birch never once left her side while she worked, lying with his chin on his paws at the edge of the lantern's light, as though standing guard over a thing he already understood to be important. When the stone finally came up, it revealed not soil, but a narrow iron ring set into a wooden trapdoor, swollen tight with 2 decades of damp, and beneath that trapdoor, a set of stone steps, descending into a darkness that smelled of cold earth, and faintly, of tallow smoke long since gone cold. She went down with her lantern held high, and Birch pressed so close against her legs, she nearly tripped over him twice, and what she found at the bottom was a low dry chamber, cut back into the hillside itself, lined in fieldstone as carefully as the mill above it, fitted with a narrow shelf bed, a rusted stove no larger than a bandbox, and along the back wall, a row of iron-banded chests that Birch went to immediately, scratching once at the nearest one, and then sitting back on his haunches to watch her, tail sweeping the dirt floor, as though he had done his part, and the rest was hers to finish. The first chest held what she at first took for tools, and then recognized, heart-hammering, as the careful hidden furnishings of a room built for people, not for storage. A stack of thin worn quilts, folded with a precision that spoke of someone who had folded them many times over many years. A child's shoe worn nearly through at the toe. Tin cups nested one inside another, and a slate still faintly scored with the alphabet in a careful adult hand. The letters worn soft at the edges, as though small fingers had traced them again and again by candlelight. She sat with that slate a long while, turning it over in her hands, and found herself thinking not of Elias Thorne, but of the unnamed person who must have knelt in this very room, teaching a child to read by a stub of tallow candle, while somewhere above their heads, the ordinary business of a fulling mill went on in full daylight. Wool pounded, and dried, and sold as though nothing at all were hidden beneath the floor. Birch had settled himself at the foot of the narrow shelf bed by then, chin on his paws, watching her with the patient stillness of a dog who understands, in whatever way dogs understand such things, that his person has found something that matters and needs quiet to sit with it. The second chest held ledgers, their leather covers gone soft with damp, but their pages, protected by oiled cloth, wrapped tight around them, still legible in a fine, deliberate script she would come to know as Elias Thorne's own. Entry after entry recorded, not bolts of cloth and shillings owed, but names. First names only, dozens of them, dated across nearly a decade, each followed by a single word, safe, and sometimes a second word beneath it, a destination, a town, a country to the north. She sat back on her heels in the lantern light, with Birch's head heavy and warm against her knee, and understood, slowly, the way understanding comes to a person who has been taught all her life to read what is hidden inside a thing, rather than only what shows on its surface, that the Thorne fulling mill had not merely processed wool in its working years. It had processed people, quietly and at terrible risk, sheltering those fleeing bondage on their way north, long before the war that finally ended it, and Elias Thorne, whom the town remembered only as an eccentric who vanished, had been running that shelter out of the very floor she now stood upon. The third chest, when she and Birch together worked its swollen lid free, held something that made the breath go clean out of her, a modest store of gold coin, carefully counted and bagged, and beneath the bags, a single folded document sealed in wax bearing Elias Thorne's own mark. A covenant he had drawn up and witnessed, but apparently never filed, declaring that upon his death, the mill and its profits were to be held in trust, not for any heir, but for the town itself, to endow a free school, and a relief fund for widows, and the destitute of Thistledown Falls in perpetuity. Pinned to the covenant with a rusted straight pin, was a second, later page in a different, more hurried hand, describing how Thorne had learned that a bank officer of the town, the document named him plainly as Josiah Pruitt, had discovered the shelter beneath the mill, and threatened to expose Thorne's work to the authorities of the day, unless he signed the mill's deed over quietly, and left the valley for good. Elias Thorne, it seemed, had chosen to vanish rather than betray the names in his ledger, sealing his life's true purpose beneath his own floor, and trusting that someday, someone with the patience to look would find it. Verity understood then, with the particular clarity that comes at the bottom of a stone stairway by lantern light, that Josiah Pruitt's grandson now sat behind the very bank desk that had signed away her family's farm, and that the ruin she had bought for $23 held the proof of a theft that had shaped the whole town for 2 generations. It was well past midnight by the time she finally climbed back up into the moonlit mill, and she slept that night on a pallet on the fulling room floor, rather than walk back to her rented room above the dry goods store, with Birch curled tight against her back, and the sealed room's secret settled quiet beneath them both, like a held breath. She told no one at first, not out of fear for herself, but out of a fuller's instinct. Her father's old lesson, returning to her whole and unbidden: a thing worked too soon, before it is properly set, comes apart in your hands. She spent the following weeks restoring the mill's working floor by day, letting the town see only a stubborn widow scrubbing stone and mending stocks, while by night, she copied Thorne's ledger names into a second book of her own, in case the first was ever lost, and made careful, patient inquiries at the county recorder's office about the mill's original deed. It did not take Silas Pruitt long to notice that Mad Verity was not simply squatting in a ruin but working it, and it took him even less time to grow uneasy about it, for a banker with something buried in his family's past has a particular nose for anyone digging where they oughtn't. He came out to the mill himself one gray afternoon, mild and courteous as always, and offered to buy the property back from her for 4 times what she'd paid, an offer so far beyond the mill's apparent worth that it told her, more plainly than any document could have, exactly how much he already suspected she'd found. She thanked him and declined, and Birch, who had greeted every other visitor to the mill with a wagging tail and an open, easy manner, stood the entire time at Verity's side, with his ears set flat, and his gaze fixed unmoving on Silas Pruitt, until the man mounted his horse and rode away. After that, the pressure came in smaller, meaner ways, the kind a man like Pruitt knew how to apply without ever raising his voice or dirtying his hands. The bank called in a technicality on her back tax arrangement, and demanded payment in full within the month. The miller who had agreed to sell her wool on credit suddenly discovered he had none to spare. 2 of the men Pruitt employed at the bank took to riding out past the mill after dark, calling out that the place was cursed, and that decent folk ought not do business with a woman who kept company with a haunted ruin. And once, in the deep hours of a moonless night, Verity woke to Birch's low, continuous growl, and the smell of coal oil, carried faint on the wind from the direction of the mill race, where she found, by lantern light, a rag-stuffed bottle set against the old wooden sluice gate, and not yet lit, abandoned in haste, at the sound of a dog's bark, carrying clear across the water. She reported nothing to the county sheriff, whom she suspected owed his post to Pruitt's backing as surely as half the town did, and instead spent the following days quietly, deliberately, letting it be known through the dry goods store and the church sewing circle that the old Thorne mill had turned out to hold papers of historical interest, nothing more specific than that, planting the idea in the town's mind gently, the way a good fuller works a stubborn fold of cloth loose rather than tearing it. A week after the incident at the sluice gate, 2 men she did not recognize came riding out to the mill at midday, dismounting near the mill race with the unhurried confidence of men who did not expect to be questioned, and began asking, pleasantly enough, whether she had given any more thought to selling. Birch, who had been dozing in a patch of sun by the mill door, was on his feet, and between Verity and the strangers, before either man had finished his sentence, not snarling, not lunging, simply standing his ground low and solid with his eyes fixed and steady in a way that made the taller of the 2 men take an involuntary step backward. She kept her voice even, and told them, as she had told Silas Pruitt himself, that the mill was not for sale at any price, and something in the flatness of her own calm, backed by the dog's unmoving stillness, seemed to unsettle the pair more than anger would have. They left without further argument, though not before the shorter man remarked, loud enough to be sure she heard it, that a woman ought to be careful what she went digging up in a haunted building. Verity only knelt afterward, and pressed her forehead briefly to the top of Birch's head, the closest thing to thanks she had words enough left for that day, and resolved that whatever came next, she would not face it slower than her dog had. She called a town meeting for the 2nd Sunday in June, in the meeting house where 3 generations of Thistledown Falls had settled its disputes, and she spent the days beforehand, rehearsing not eloquence, but plainness, remembering her father's old lesson, that a fuller who tries to hurry a stubborn fold only tears the cloth. The hall was fuller than she had expected when she arrived. Farmers and shopkeepers and the sewing circle women all crowded onto the hard benches, drawn as much by 2 months of rumor as by the notice she had posted at the church door, and she felt the whole room's eyes settle on her the moment she stepped up to the long table at the front with Birch, calm and steady, lying down at her feet exactly where she had trained him to hold. She came prepared not with accusations, but with evidence laid out plain for anyone to examine afterward. Elias Thorne's sealed covenant, his ledger of names and safe passages, and the county recorder's own confirmation, obtained that week, that the deed by which the Pruitt family bank had first claimed partial rights to the mill's watercourse, bore a witness signature dated 3 years before the supposed witness had even moved to the county. Silas Pruitt stood at the back of the hall with his composure cracking by degrees as she read Thorne's covenant aloud in full, the promise of a free school, and a widow's relief fund that his own grandfather had buried along with a good man's name, rather than let it stand, his hat turning slowly in his hands, as murmurs began to travel the room ahead of her. When she reached the ledger and read out, one by one, the handful of first names still legible on its water-spotted pages, an elderly farmer near the front rose unsteadily to his feet, and said, in a voice that shook only a little, that his own grandmother had once whispered of a girl and a baby who passed safely through the valley in the hard years before the war, a family story he had always taken for a fireside tale, and nothing more. The room went so still after that Verity could hear Birch's tail, beneath the table, tapping once, twice, against the floorboards, as if he too understood that a truth long buried had finally come up for air. By the time she finished speaking, the town's anger had found its rightful target at last, and it was not aimed at her. What followed in the weeks after was not triumph exactly, but something steadier, and Verity thought, more lasting than triumph would have been. The county recorder, presented with dated proof of the falsified witness, opened a formal inquiry into the old water rights transfer, and though Silas Pruitt kept his position at the bank a while longer, he did so with the whole town now watching him, the way one watches a man who has been caught once, and might be caught again, his easy authority gone thin and brittle as old ice. Verity used the recovered gold. By unanimous vote of a committee she insisted be made up of her neighbors, rather than herself alone, to found the free school Elias Thorne had intended, and to seed a relief fund for the valley's widows that carried, at her quiet request, no name upon its ledger but Thorne's own. The mill itself she reopened as a working fulling house once more, teaching the trade to anyone willing to learn it exactly as her father had once taught her, and within a year, the ruin the town had laughed at was humming again with the sound of the stocks and the smell of wet wool, run by the woman they now called, without a trace of mockery, simply Verity. Reuben Ashcombe, for his part, never came to apologize, and Verity found she no longer needed him to. The school Thorne's gold had built stood finished by the following autumn, a plain sturdy building, with his covenant's original words carved above the door, and on its first morning, she stood at the edge of the yard, with Birch beside her, and watched a dozen children file in, among them 2 whose mothers had been widowed by the same hard summers that had once put Verity out of her own home. She kept the hidden room beneath the floor exactly as she had found it, quilts, and slate and all, and had a small brass plate set into the flagstone above it bearing Elias Thorne's name, and the single word he had written so many times in his ledger, safe. Visitors to the mill in later years would sometimes ask her why she never sold a single one of the recovered coins for her own comfort, given how little she had come into the property with, and she always gave them the same plain answer, that a thing built to shelter people oughtn't be quietly turned to shelter only one, and that she had learned that lesson, in the end, from a dog who had never once needed it explained to him at all. We told you at the start that a young widow, cast out with almost nothing, had spent her last dollars on a ruin nobody wanted, and that her dog's nose would lead her to something that would change her life, and restore a whole community's stolen name, and now you have seen how a thing thrown away as worthless, an old building, an old ledger, an old act of quiet courage, can hold more value than anyone standing above it ever guessed. Verity Ashcombe did not find gold beneath that flagstone so much as she found a truth someone had tried very hard to bury, and it was Birch's patient nose, not any human cleverness, that first told her the ground beneath her feet was not as empty as the town believed. That, we think, is the real inheritance this story leaves behind, that overlooked people, and overlooked places, are so often overlooked, simply because no one has yet taken the trouble to kneel down and listen to them properly, the way a good dog does, and the way Verity's father once taught her a good Fuller must. The town that once laughed at Mad Verity on the courthouse steps came, in time, to understand that her foolishness had never been foolishness at all, only a kind of faith, too patient and too quiet for anyone else to recognize until it had already proven itself, and Birch, growing gray around the muzzle in his later years, spent his last easy seasons dozing in that same patch of sun by the mill door, guarding a secret that no longer needed guarding, only remembering. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with us, and with Verity and Birch. If their story moved you, we hope you'll share it with someone who could use a reminder that foolishness and faith can look exactly alike from the outside. Before you go, we'd love to know, is there a discarded, unwanted place in your own life, a project, a relationship, a version of yourself, that you suspect might be worth a second, closer look? Tell us in the comments below. Until next time, stay close.